Again. So welcome everyone now officially to the second session of our virtual Kant Congress with a cosmopolitan purpose. And our session today will be coordinated by the Korean Kant Society. And the topic of the session is Kant and Confucianism, which is a fascinating topic. And it suits very well to the whole idea of this Congress. So we are very much looking forward to it. And the moderator and the person responsible for putting together this session is Hala Kim, who is professor of philosophy at the Sogang University in Seoul. So I think the session will be very interesting. And if you could perhaps just switch on your cameras, if possible at all, so that we can have this feeling that we are sharing the same space, the same room, it would be very nice. For those, if it's not possible for you to do this, it's also perfectly fine. And after the session is over, we will remain connected to have some informal conversations. And of course, all of you are warmly welcome to stay also for this more informal part. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Professor Hala Kim, who will coordinate the session. So Hala, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Luis. Hello, everyone. My name is Hala Kim, professor of philosophy. I am very pleased and happy to have the opportunity to introduce Professor
No
Kim
sound, no
today.
sound, no audio.
I'm very sorry. What can we do?
Go ahead, Hala. I will talk to him over the chat.
All right. Thank you, Luis. Speaker today, Professor Kim is Professor Emerita of Philosophy at Ewha Women's University in Seoul, South Korea. She has been teaching at Ewha Women's University for more than 30 years, and is known for academic excellence as well as administrative achievement. She even served as a president of the university for almost 4 years. Professor Kim's specialty includes Kant, transcendental argument, ethics, as well as feminism. Her publications include Transcendental Arguments, Objectivity, and the Nature of Philosophical Inquiry, and also Kant, Philosophy at the Limit and the Limit of Philosophy. Most recently, she wrote an article entitled Yin Yang, The Ethics of Contingency. She was also president of Korean Philosophical Association back in 2012 till 2013, and also worked on the committee, director of the FISP, Federation of International Society of Philosophy as well. Today, she'll deliver a lecture entitled Knowledge Without Transcendental Justification, an examination of Confucianism through a Kantian lens. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kim. Professor Kim, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Professor Hala Kim. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be invited to the VKC relay session, meeting Kant scholars and researchers from across the world, albeit virtually. Thanks to technology, the world seems to be increasingly smaller. I'd like to express my gratitude to the organizers of this wonderful virtual conference and also to the Korean Kant Society for the invitation. My talk today is based on the keynote speech I gave at the Society for Asian and Comparative Philosophy held last fall in San Francisco. Before starting my talk, I will share the PPT file I have prepared. So please wait for a moment. You can see the screen. Okay. My talk is a kind of response to two questions I had for a long time. The first question is philosophy uniquely of Greek origin? It is widely accepted by Western philosophers that Asian philosophy is not philosophy, but rather a collection of ideas and thoughts. The second question is how can we compare two different philosophical traditions with distinct layers regarding philosophical problems, modes of thought, and methodologies? How can we foster understanding of Asian philosophies among Western philosophers? I want you to have these two questions in mind when you listen to my talk. My talk consists of 6 parts. 1, the hierarchy of knowledge, the superfluousness of meta-knowledge, a Confucian way out, a Wittgensteinian way out, the role of examples in ethics, and the last part is sensitizing the ethics in Confucian tradition. Let me briefly recapitulate my talk. Philosophy as a discipline does not generate knowledge of objects, nor does it compete with science in that regard. Positioned as a second level of knowledge, its primary role is critical and reflective, as shown by Kant. However, this critique and reflection must have its boundaries to prevent falling into an infinite regress of criticism. Within certain aspects of Confucianism, we encounter opportunities to contemplate the nature of philosophy and the possibility of generating knowledge without transcendental justification. It is the knowledge manifested in sensible forms of ethics and aesthetics. In my talk today, I attempt to elucidate the intricate workings of human rationality by posing the contrasting philosophical traditions of the East and the West. The spectrum of comparative philosophy is so extensive that its boundaries and subdivisions remain nebulous. Furthermore, its objectives and methodologies are equally elusive. Does it aim to foster mutual understanding, expand our knowledge, strive for a unified philosophy, or seek fresh philosophical insights and wisdom to enhance our lives? When embarking on a comparison between Eastern and Western philosophical traditions, our starting point often involves common issues, themes, and assumptions, with a focus on discerning similarities and disparities between these two intellectual traditions. As I delve into the realm of comparative philosophy, I have encountered numerous intriguing facets that can be analyzed through the lenses of metaphysics, ethics, and logic as categorized in Western philosophy. However, many scholars have observed a notable absence of epistemological interest and inquiry in the intellectual tradition of East Asia, especially within the Confucian tradition. An epistemological pursuit typically emerges in contexts where skepticism about the possibility of knowledge poses a significant challenge to the intellect. Consequently, there arises a heightened need to establish the foundation of knowledge and delineate the criteria for truth and objective knowledge. In the Western philosophical tradition, the questions stemming from Greek skepticism have long captivated the minds of philosophers. These questions revolve around the verticality of our perceptions, the approach of our knowledge, the boundaries and extent of rational ethics. Sextus Empiricus left works on Pyrrhonian skepticism that was reintroduced in Europe during the early modern period. These works had a significant impact on the subsequent development of theoretical philosophy, which aimed at achieving mental equilibrium, the radical challenges of judging and establishing truth. Cartesian skepticism centered on the quest for certainty as an epistemological ideal between the subjective mind and the objective world. Western philosophy past few centuries. Various philosophers have sought to establish the ultimate criteria for truth and objective knowledge, while others have maintained skepticism or embraced a pragmatic stance regarding objective knowledge. Some philosophers, such as Nietzsche, Marx, later Wittgenstein, Rorty, and contemporary postmodern philosophers, even have revolted against the established tradition of theoretical philosophy, engendering a discourse on the end of philosophy. Whether it is Pyrrhonian, Cartesian, Humean, or postmodern, skepticism in the Western philosophical tradition raises questions about the normativity and justifiability of knowledge. In contrast, Eastern philosophies generally lack a strong theoretical interest in probing the nature of philosophical knowledge or the act of teaching. One possible exception probably is Buddhist philosophy, which East Asian tradition, however, often exhibit less inclination toward justifying their intellectual pursuits or offering explicit explanations of the nature of the knowledge they present. Certainly, philosophers in the East were aware of the distinct nature of their pursuits, leading to numerous intellectual confrontations among Eastern philosophers. However, I won't delve into an exhaustive examination of the underlying epistemological motivation ideals within the intellectual history of East Asia, including the various concepts of knowledge and truth, such as knowing, awakening, believing, wisdom, way, etc. Such an exploration demands a comprehensive analysis that integrates historical, anthropological, cultural, and conceptual studies alongside textual analyses. Instead, our focus on contrasting attitudes exhibited by traditional philosophers in the East and the West towards a particular form of knowledge, now referred to as philosophy. I will explore the implications of these distinct attitudes for the evolution of philosophical methods. In particular, I aim to consider various approaches to addressing the paradox that emerges at the boundary of reason and knowledge, and contemplate whether philosophy can get on the secure path of science as Kant wanted a long time ago. Is philosophy as scientia or a theory possible? The first, I will think about the hierarchy of knowledge. Philosophers, whether from the Western or Eastern traditions, have consistently sought to attain the highest echelons of knowledge. They are not preoccupied with the practicalities of how to make meals or houses and how to grow plants. Instead, they grapple with inquiries that lie at the core of human existence, the meaning of life, the essence of human existence and the world, the possibility of objective knowledge, the ethical and moral values and principles that should guide us. These inquiries are often classified as metaphysical, and they rarely yield straightforward, universally agreed upon answers. Immersing us in this enigmatic pursuit, Kant initiated of pure reason by elucidating the philosophical conundrum that Kant was so used by the French speaker last time. So I'm very glad to hear that he used this quotation. The quote, human reason has this peculiar fate that in one species of its knowledge, it is burdened by questions, which is prescribed by the very nature of reason itself, it is not able to ignore, but which, as transcending all its powers, it is also not able to answer, unquote. Metaphysics in the era considered as a pursuit aimed at acquiring special knowledge to satiate the demands of reason, which perpetually sought further explanations until it reached the ultimate, the unconditioned, and the absolute. In the Aristotelian tradition, metaphysics was defined as a study of being qua being, or being of beings. Aristotle posited that the principle of non-contradiction stood as the highest principle of being, as its validity was irrefutable. Denying it led to self-refutation, rendering the principle impervious to skepticism. This principle served as an underlying presupposition in all realms of existence and language, ultimately constituting the final arbiter of our existence, thought, and communication. Metaphysical knowledge, distinguished as the highest form of knowledge, sets itself apart from empirical knowledge by its having necessity and universality. Metaphysics in Kantian terms can be construed as an endeavor to formulate answers to questions that were imposed on reason through reason itself. These questions revolve around the thinking self, the world as a sum total of the causal chains of phenomena and for the possibility of all that can be thought. Kant identifies these as there's a reason that may be put in other terms, respectively as immortality of the soul, freedom, and God. Kant states, quote, metaphysics has as the proper object of its inquiries the three ideas only, unquote. In the first part of the first critique, Kant bemoaned the sorry state of metaphysics in his era using the metaphor of Hecuba's descent from queenhood to wandering. He believed that traditional metaphysics became despotic dogmatism, making groundless pretensions. Consequently, reason must respond to a call given to itself, a call for self-criticism and self-knowledge. Understanding the nature and limitations of reason became imperative. This, in essence, constitutes the primary task of the critique of pure reason. The critique serves a dual purpose. It establishes the groundwork for our knowledge about the world while also unveiling the intellectual presumptions that traditional metaphysics had propagated, extending beyond the boundaries of our understanding and experience. Once hailed as the queen of science, metaphysics had regressed into a realm of pseudo, imparting nothing more than illusions of knowledge. Kant's critique of traditional metaphysics left a profound imprint on the subsequent evolution of philosophy in the post-Kantian era. Kant's critical philosophy rendered metaphysics important in its assertions and claims. Philosophers, according to Kant, are not tasked with seeking realities beyond our worldly experiences, such as the being of beings. Instead, their role is to probe the conditions of knowledge and the boundaries of reason. Philosophical thought unfolds at the juncture and periphery of our existence, yet it possesses no privileged access to realms beyond the confines of human reason. Human knowledge is perpetually constrained by the conditions of knowing, that is, sensibility and concepts. Philosophical thinking exhibits a paradoxical nature. It transpires within our world while simultaneously transcending the realm of experience by exploring the essence and significance of the whole world and human existence in its entirety. To assume its position at the thresholds of the world and life, philosophy must first ascertain the location of these boundaries. But how can this be achieved? When philosophy strives to delineate the conditions of knowledge, it necessitates a vantage point beyond itself, a form of specialized knowledge, often referred to as meta-knowledge or knowledge of knowledge. Yet the challenge lies in justifying this meta-knowledge as it remains impervious to verification through conventional means of knowledge. What is meta-knowledge? How can we justify it? Kant's critical philosophy bequeathed to us the quandary of the status of philosophical knowledge. Post-Kant, the nature of philosophy became deeply intriguing, evolving into a form of self-knowledge. Philosophers too became acutely aware of this aspect of philosophical inquiry. I will go over the next part, the superfluousness of meta-knowledge. Philosophers in the tradition of logical positivism rejected the validity of the meta-level or the second level of knowledge. Positivists expressed strong doubts on metaphysical concepts such as self and being. When philosophy remains confined within the realm of empirical experiences, the status of philosophical knowledge becomes a subject of controversy and may even seem superfluous. Philosophy would diverge from the secure path of science as Kant termed it. Kant established a unique space for philosophy, a special zone where transcendental knowledge is made possible. However, naturalized epistemologists like Quine challenged the Kantian approach to objective knowledge by relegating the issues of justification, quid iuris, and skepticism to the domain of believe it or not. According to them, natural science, rather than philosophy, should serve as the final arbiter of truth. In contrast to the Western theoretical philosophy, which has been primarily preoccupied with the question of the possibility of objective knowledge and the question of final justification in face of skeptical challenges, East Asian philosophers have not placed as much ostensive concern on problems related to the justification of knowledge and the status of philosophical knowledge. While Taoist philosophers embrace a relativist attitude and Buddhist philosophers exhibit a distrust of conceptual ramifications of truth, particularly within the Zen Buddhist tradition, their philosophical attitudes may be perceived as a form of skepticism challenging the asserted credibility and infallibility of human reason. However, it would be unjust to assess Taoism and Buddhism within the same epistemological context, given that they operate in a sphere where concerns about objectivity and the relationship between the world reality and representations ideas are not paramount. What warrants emphasis is the fact that East Asian philosophers were not inclined to engage in justificatory argument for their philosophies, unlike their Western counterparts. Kant, in the transcendental dialectic part of the first critique, highlighted the paradox that emerges when making claims about the whole, the totality, the absolute, concepts that transcend our sense experiences. Philosophical knowledge, at best, delves into the ultimate presuppositions of our understanding, rather than exploring the nature of the ultimate beings. It becomes evident that we cannot theoretically prove the ultimate truth of our holistic beliefs. This insight stems from Kant's critique of traditional metaphysics. While some have contested Kant's critical philosophy as pseudo-knowledge, it has catalyzed profound transformations within Western philosophy, giving rise to various new approaches and even sparking debates about the end of philosophy. It is very likely that East Asian philosophers were cognizant, or at least aware of the paradox inherent in human knowledge concerning the ultimate and the real. This awareness can be discerned at the very least in Zen Buddhism, where ordinary discourse logic breaks down when addressing matters of truth. The paradox emerges when we endeavor to explore what lies beyond the scope of human reason and language, using reason and language themselves. In other words, it arises when we attempt to stand simultaneously within and outside the bounds of human rationality. The paradox, in fact, has intrigued Western philosophers since the early days when the liar paradox was first introduced. It originates from the limitations of reason and the inherent inability of reason to validate itself. Human reason perennially falls short of divine intelligence, necessitating perpetual mediation by others. It advances through discursive reasoning rather than intuitive grasping. It cannot shed light on matters that transcend these mediations, such as the absolute self or the pure self. Self-knowledge and self-reflection are universally recognized as exceedingly challenging topics shared by both Eastern and Western philosophical traditions. While Confucius, as depicted in the Analects, doesn't delve into the theoretical underpinnings of his teachings or strive to validate their veracity, his renowned response to inquiries about death, where he admits his lack of knowledge on the subject, hints at the notion that life itself is complex and challenging to fathom, let alone what lies beyond it, death. He exercises great caution in imparting his wisdom, emphasizing that he merely transmits the cherished and trusted ancient traditions rather than formulating novel doctrines. Confucius does not seek to justify his teachings by appealing to their inherent truth or invoking metaphysical concepts and principles. Instead, he presents Confucian cardinal virtues like benevolence and sincerity as foundational ethical values requiring no external justification or verification. These values have been passed down through the ages, embraced by individuals who have held them dear and relied upon them as repositories of proven wisdom. Even Confucius himself refrains from exploring alternative concepts or innovations, firmly rooted in the belief that there exists no knowledge more fundamental than the wisdom embedded in the timeless traditions and the lives of the revered sages. In contrast to Confucius and earlier Confucian scholars, philosophers within the Neo-Confucian tradition actively endeavored to establish metaphysical and cosmological foundations for Confucian concepts, employing the conceptual framework of Li and Qi. It is widely acknowledged that Jushi synthesized the ideas of Judon-I, Zhangje, Zhang-I. The ideas such as the supreme ultimate, Taichi, the unity of original nature, Song, and Li expressed in the principle, Song-Jik Li, and Qi as the fundamental force of the cosmos served as the metaphysical bedrock of Neo-Confucianism. However, despite their theoretical intricacies, Neo-Confucian metaphysical assertions regarding the nature of reality and our ethical obligations can be viewed as dogmatic through a Kantian lens. They lack transcendental justifications that would provide compelling reasons for us to accept these claims necessarily. While Neo-Confucian worldviews indeed provide ancient Confucianism as practiced by Confucius and Mencius with added theoretical depth and richness, by exploring the nature and unity of the human mind and the universe, their primary focus lies in justifying Confucian social orders and rules of propriety through the concepts of heaven, original nature, principle, and material energy. The doctrine of the mean commences with the assertion that what is ordained by heaven is referred to as the original nature, and to follow this original nature is to adhere to the way. Jushi's interpretation posits that this original nature is synonymous with the principle Li, and that heaven, through the interplay of yin-yang, gives rise to and transforms the myriad things. In this process, Qi makes their forms where Li is imposed as the original nature inherent within them. Consequently, everything, including individuals, both men and women, is obligated to follow the nature originating a priori from heaven. For humans, there exist 5 unswerving virtues: benevolence or humaneness, righteousness, rules of propriety, wisdom, faith, all of which heaven instructs individuals to nurture in their daily lives. These virtues are akin to Kant's categorical imperatives as they originate from the nature of practical reason, that is, moral ability, revealing the essence of what defines us as human beings. There cannot be a transcendental justification what is ordained by heaven or the arc rationality. Both Jushi and Kant would concur that there is no definitive answer to the question of why we should be moral. At most, we can respond by stating that it is because we are human. The circularity problem arises when we attempt to define what it means to be human in terms of moral nature and capability. I will go over to a third part of my talk, a Confucian way out. One important difference between the two positions, Jushian and Kantian, lies in the fact that within Confucian tradition, moral thinking is not typically extended to the meta level of contemplating morality itself, that is, what it is to be moral. Kant, on the other hand, endeavors to delineate meta conditions under which our actions attain moral significance and establishes a principle by which we can assess and test the moral status of our actions. Zhu also invokes metaphysical concepts such as heaven without providing justification. Instead of constructing arguments or providing explanations regarding the nature of morality, that is, what it is to be moral, Jushi takes a different approach by leveraging the authority of his revered predecessors to justify Confucian moral virtues. In the preface of the Doctrine of the Mean, he mentions his efforts to edit the text while carrying forward the legacy of ancient sacred emperors, kings, and scholars, including luminaries such as Yao, Shun, Yu, Mun, Mu, Confucius, Mencius, and Jishi. Jushi adheres to the tradition of preserving and transmitting ancient wisdom solely through annotations and interpretations of the inherited teachings. The fact that the transcendental justification of knowledge, in this case moral knowledge, aiming to establish its universality and necessity, is supplanted by the authority of past sages, offers insight into the contrasting philosophical attitudes that have evolved within the traditions of both the East and the West. This divergence will be further examined in the subsequent discussion. Kant's transcendental philosophy marked a pivotal shift in the realm of knowledge, particularly in its relationship with traditional metaphysics. It dismantled the notion of traditional metaphysics as the highest form of knowledge, arguing that claims concerning the world, the self, and God lacked objective significance because they remained beyond the purview of empirical knowledge and the ability to undergo empirical tests for truth or falsity. However, Kant's philosophical framework allowed moral metaphysics as meaningful because moral objects represented by moral actions become tangible through our own will. Within the domain of moral metaphysics, we may engage in a philosophically meaningful exploration into the themes such as the freedom, the principles, and the autonomy of the will. In Kantian ethics, moral principles serve as the cornerstone of moral actions. These principles, while not inherently moral themselves, establish the necessary conditions and standards by which we discern and define what constitutes a moral action. Identifying the meta and the critical levels of thought in the Confucian tradition can be a complex task. The Neo-Confucian development of metaphysical framework concerning human nature could be viewed as a form of meta-theory. Within the Confucian tradition, we have a set of 5 cardinal virtues along with various moral values intricately tied to human relationships, such as filial piety, sibling love, loyalty to superiors, and many others. These virtues not only define various relationships, but also imbue them with distinct emotional and moral dimensions. These virtues not only prescribe the essential nature of human relationships, but also confer specific emotional and moral significance to each one. It is believed that these values are divinely ordained by heaven, making heaven the ultimate source of justification. However, the philosophical nature of heaven remains a point of contention in Confucianism. Is heaven an agent with a volitional power, or is it a mere symbol of a priority in an ontological or merely a logical sense? Or is it like a Kantian ideal reason? How does heaven function in actual moral deliberations? For today's discussion, I will set aside these questions and focus on the aspect relevant to the justification of philosophical knowledge. The use of examples to illustrate the central moral values with the Confucian tradition is, I believe, connected to the challenge of justification. Let me briefly look over a Wittgensteinian way out of the paradox. Kant sought to establish the validity of his philosophical positions through transcendental arguments while refuting metaphysical dogmatism. Transcendental arguments are designed to demonstrate that we cannot but accept certain philosophical principles and concepts as objective and fundamental due to their necessity and universality in explaining the possibility of our experiences. These principles and concepts must be embraced not because they objectively mirror or correspond to what is real, but because they have an inherent necessity and a priority in relation to our experiences. However, philosophical knowledge encounters a limitation when we venture to assert that this knowledge, that is, philosophy itself, pertains to the absolute or the things in themselves. In such instances, we find ourselves in a paradoxical situation where there can be no rationality, no intellect, and no philosophy that can provide a kind of justification we seek. Wittgenstein, in his short lecture on ethics, expresses a viewpoint similar to Kant's perspective on metaphysics in spirit by advocating the impossibility of ethics or religion constructing meaningful discourse. When we endeavor to make claims about the meaning of life as a whole, the absolute good, or heaven within a Confucian context, we grapple with the paradox of employing a language that is either vacuous or nonsensical. He says, quote, "One can wonder at the existence of, say, a house when one sees it and has not visited it for a long time and has imagined that it had been pulled down in the meantime. But it is nonsense to say that I wonder at the existence of the world because I cannot imagine it not existing. I see now that these nonsensical expressions were not nonsensical because I had not yet found the correct expressions, but that their nonsensicality was their very essence. For all I wanted to do with them was just to go beyond the world, and that is to say, beyond significant language. My whole tendency, and I believe the tendency of all men, whoever tried to write or talk ethics or religion, was to run against the boundaries of language. This running against the walls of our cage is perfectly, absolutely hopeless," unquote. The quote might evoke the stance of logical positivists toward metaphysics. However, Wittgenstein makes it clear that he holds deep respect for ethics and would not, for his life, ridicule it. He may believe that ethics and religion constitute essential aspects of our lives, yet he contends that they cannot be subject to theoretical inquiry to yield knowledge. Wittgenstein concludes his philosophical investigation where Kant embarks on the voyage of transcendental or critical philosophy. In contrast to Wittgenstein, Kant maintains faith in philosophy's ability to discover the axioms governing both our experiences of the world and moral actions. In the Confucian ethical tradition, we find ourselves located in a vastly distinct context. However, within East Asian traditional philosophies, there seems to be an implicit recognition of the paradoxical nature of nature inherent in metaphysical assertions about the ultimate. This recognition often manifests through their frequent utilization of metaphors, parables, fables, and ancient narratives to illustrate their points and explanations. For instance, the Confucian thinkers frequently employ examples to elucidate moral principles and concepts. The story of Emperor Shun's devoted care for his stepmother serves as an illustration of the virtue of filial piety. Confucius' narrative about a man concealing his father's theft instead of reporting it to the authorities exemplifies uprightness and justice, and Mencius' use of an example involving the instinctive action of rescuing a child from the danger of falling into water demonstrates the innate virtue of compassion. These well-known cases vividly showcase moral virtues and principles. Lesser Learning, a textbook aimed at young learners, abounds with stories that illustrate the central Confucian virtues. While these examples proved particularly effective in moral education for the youth, they also played a role in enlightening illiterate individuals within the broad population through the oral transmission of these stories. However, the question arises, what is the connection between concrete cases and examples that illustrate abstract values and the paradoxes inherent in philosophical knowledge? The paradox emerges when we contemplate the boundary conditions within which we navigate our moral existence and formulate moral judgments. We find ourselves unable to substantiate the truth or objectivity of the overarching framework that governs our lives. There exists no definitive reality regarding the comprehensive scope of rationality and normativity, thereby allowing contradictory assertions to be made about it. The fundamental values of Confucianism and the concept of heaven, for instance, elude complete explanation for why we must embrace them. At best, we may assert that we should adopt Confucian values like filial piety to lead a genuinely human life, as these values mirror the inherent attributes of human existence. But this argument does not establish the universality and the necessity of Confucian values as representing humanity in an essential way, as there could be alternative principles or values that define humanity. If we endeavor to validate these values using other values, we risk falling into an infinite regress. What Kant primarily demonstrates in his work is the establishment of test conditions for determining the moral nature of a subjective maxim. Kant's focus remains at the meta level of moral thinking, encompassing discussions about the essence of practical reason, freedom, and autonomy. In contrast, Confucian philosophy operates primarily at the foundational level of moral norms and practices. It involves actively seeking out real-life moral situations and individuals who embody core Confucian values. In a context where the reality of heaven and its intrinsic connection to values like filial piety as a reflection of heaven's order cannot be theoretically proven, employing a strategy of enumerating concrete cases and virtuous actions by exceptional individuals, often referred to as sages, serves as a robust means of upholding moral norms and codes through inductive justification. By presenting a multitude of exemplary actions through diverse mediums such as stories, paintings, and writings, and by persuading people empirically and inductively through tangible instances, we can navigate the challenges associated with paradoxes, circular reasoning, infinite regress, and petitio principii, begging the question problem that we might encounter when attempting a theoretical justification of concepts like heaven or similar ideas. Next, the role of examples in ethics. Examples in ethics serve as illuminating narratives that shed light on the actions or life stories of exemplary individuals, thereby highlighting their moral significance, both in positive and negative contexts. These narratives can function as either models for emulation or as cautionary tales to deter certain behaviors. During the pre-modern Korean dynasty, the Joseon dynasty, Confucianism, encompassing both old and neo-Confucian thought, was employed as the official ideology. In the early period of this dynasty, King Sejong, who initiated significant development by inventing the Korean phonetic alphabet, commissioned a Confucian literary official to create a storybook complete with illustrations containing more than 300 stories. These stories celebrated the virtues of filial piety between fathers and sons, loyalty between kings and subjects, and faithfulness in women. This book, known as Samganghaengshildo, its illustrated guide to the three bonds, was continuously reprinted for over 400 years until the end of Joseon dynasty, with subsequent editions featuring additions and revisions that showcased ever higher levels of sacrifices and devotion. Its primary purpose was to educate the common people in the principles of Confucian virtues. These stories often depicted ideal and abstract values, but they also included extreme and radical actions to emphasize the importance of these virtues. Whether as examples to emulate or as cautionary tales, these narratives played a pivotal role in shaping the ethical and moral landscape of Joseon Korea. Confucian examples contend beyond mere factual accounts. They serve as normative teachings, offering recommendations and even prescriptions for individuals to emulate. These narratives do not merely chronicle historical events, despite their focus on individuals from the past in China or Korea. Instead, they are intricately tied to Confucian cardinal virtues, reinforcing the Confucian patriarchal hierarchy. This illustration depicts the virtuous son, Hyangdeok, called Hyangdeok, who in a display of profound filial piety selflessly removed portion of flesh from his thigh to provide substance for his ailing mother during a time of food scarcity. This illustration is accompanied by a narrative presented in both Chinese and Korean language. Picture and Chinese written in Chinese characters and written in Korean letters. Regarding the earlier question I raised in my lecture about justification, there is a notable advantage in approaching ethics through the use of examples without delving deeply into its a priori foundations or sources. This approach has the merit of circumventing the paradox that would arise when dealing with the knowledge of totality, such as understanding being as a whole or the entirety of human living. Ethics and the moral theory in the West are fundamentally concerned with moral deliberation and justification, specifically how to navigate particular situations and make choices. In his book, Philosophy as Cultural Politics, Rorty presents an interesting perspective, asserting that what is so-called a philosophical question makes sense only if there is an alternative account or choice. For instance, the question, why should I be moral, arises only when two or more alternative practical identities are under consideration. Abstracting from all concrete choices and possibilities, the question becomes idle or empty. It is analogous, he claims, to the situation where the question, why should I think this podium and these chairs to be real, is not trivial or empty only if an alternative account of the appearances is seriously suggested and weighed for a final decision, such as the notion that they might be illusions generated by needles stuck in my brain. From a pragmatic standpoint, what truly matters is not necessarily the origins, nor ultimate reasons or motivations behind moral choices, but rather the consequences they entail. In the following quotation, we can get a clearer understanding of Rorty's argument in relation to my discussion. The quotation, you may see the quotation here. Quote, Wittgensteinians think that you get ideas that outstrip the actual from the same place we get ideas that delimit the actual, from the people who taught us how to use the words that are used to formulate those ideas. From this perspective, the question, what are the sources of normativity, has no appeal than what are the sources of facticity. For a norm is just certain kind of fact, a fact about what people do seen from the inside, unquote. Rorty's assertion sheds light on a particular aspect of Confucian ethics and morality in the use of examples. It could even serve as a supporting argument for the minimal consideration given to the theoretical justifications of central values and concepts in this context. However, when we adopt individuals and their actual lives as guides for our moral deliberations and actions, we must engage with interpretations of the situations occurring in our surroundings. For instance, in a story from Sangang-Hengshito titled as Kwak bearing his son, in this story, Kwak endeavors to bury his son to provide subsistence for his elderly mother during a food shortage. While the story concludes with fortunate outcome resulting from mysterious sources rewarding his actions, readers within Confucian society would internalize the message that they too should be willing to make significant sacrifices to care for their parents. When faced with a moral conflict between tending to one's parents and meeting the needs of one's child, the Kwak example explicitly advises us to prioritize the well-being of our parents. These examples are so straightforward and overt that they may hinder deeper moral thinking and reflection. The examples and cases presented effectively embody and manifest Confucian ideas and values. Their primary role is to disseminate actions that bring these Confucian values to life through repetition. Through the repetitive nature of human actions and their performativity, the world and its order are shaped by these actions, resulting in the emergence of a distinct culture, namely a Confucian culture. Confucian ideas that have been mere concepts now become tangible realities. As more practices and performances adhere to the Confucian order, the Confucian world gains strength all without the need for transcendental justification. To borrow from Hegel at this stage, the rational becomes real, the real becomes rational. When Confucian ideas attain full realization in reality, and this reality becomes all-encompassing, inquiries into the objectivity of these ideas become superfluous as the ideas themselves have already been concretely realized and objectified. However, if an alternative reality emerges where the fundamental social relations of parent, children, king, subject, and man-wife are no longer constitutive of society, then a critical demand for the justification of Confucian ideas becomes relevant. In this altered reality, the real is no longer necessarily rational as it deviates from the Confucian framework, and the rational is no longer entirely real as what we attain through our thoughts and actions remain partial. The last part. In his third critique, Kant, while discussing taste and aesthetic judgment, asserts that some products of taste serve as exemplars in that people emulate as models. He believes that the judgment of beauty is rooted in subjective feeling, but can lead us to universality. Although an aesthetic judgment pertains to an individual presentation of an object, it touches upon the underlying universally shared grounds of agreement, invoking a sense of universal communicability of sensation, be it pleasure or displeasure. Through an individual object of taste, such as a work of art, we can experience agreement in judgment without relying on definite concept or universal or an a priori criterion of the aesthetic beauty. We may engage our imaginations to emulate it and strive to embody its idea and spirit in our own presentations. Kant's argument on the subjective universality of aesthetic judgment is valuable in my current discussion. The Confucian practice of using examples illustrates that we can collectively share a sense of virtue, like the feeling of filial piety, without recourse to moral principles or theories. An illustration or a story presents an individual case directly appealing to our subjective feeling, devoid of explicit concepts or principles, and as such, it does not require justification. Despite the subjectivity of the feeling, the narrative resonates with individuals living within the same Confucian culture, evoking sympathetic agreement in feelings and sensations. I believe that these feelings and sensations encompass both ethical and aesthetic dimensions. An individual case serving as an exemplar of virtue elevates us to the realm of universality and necessity, where we all share similar sentiments and feel compelled to act in the same spirit. Confucian ethics is closely intertwined with aesthetics, as Confucius suggests that ultimate beauty is synonymous with ultimate goodness and vice versa. This concept is encapsulated in the terminology like a beautiful story, used to describe a narrative about virtuous deeds. By appealing to the aesthetic dimension of sensible forms of actions and rituals, Confucian ethics has carved out its own distinctive identity, deeply ingraining itself in the sensibilities of its adherents. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your question, Professor.
Thank you.
I believe that we have about 30 minutes or so for the Q&A. So as part of the program, I mean. So shall we open up the floor? And then let's see, Professor, let's start with you, Professor Stelos Vividarkis.
Well, thank you. I'm talking from Athens, and I must say how happy I am to see my old friend Hesuk. It was very good to hear you. Thank you for this fascinating talk. Well, I'm going to ask there are many questions that I would like to ask, but I'll try to limit myself to 2 questions. First of all, there is something which is totally absent from the Confucian picture of morality, which is an obvious disanalogy with Kant. And I would like you to confirm my impression. There is no reference whatsoever to freedom or autonomy, because as you know, if there is some attempt at a transcendental justification of moral knowledge or practical moral knowledge in Kant, this is related to the fact of reason related to freedom. And this seems to be totally absent. And I wonder if this is really the case, if there is something analogous in the Confucian tradition or in other Asian tradition, philosophical tradition. That's due to ignorance in a way, because I mean, I don't know enough. And then the other question relates to virtue ethics. When you moved to forms of life, actually, when you spoke about agreement in judgment. And then I kept thinking of this Wittgensteinian idea that you have an agreement in a form of life. And this has been related by some scholars to a virtue ethical approach, which you find, for instance, in neo-Aristotelian ethics, where you don't need transcendental justification. And I wonder to what extent Confucian virtue ethics is much more analogous to, Aristotelian moral thinking and questions of justification that, can be raised about virtue systems or virtue ideas, virtue traditions. And then, of course, you don't need a transcendental justification. And then the ultimate extension of this question would be, do you think that this, if it is indeed a virtue ethical tradition, is there any room for principles which, would not need transcendental justification? And to what extent can this be a basis for a universalist ethics or a global ethics? Because one of the criticisms of Aristotelian models or neo-Aristotelian models is that they are old or parochial or superseded and very local. So these are the questions which, made me think. But thank you so much. It's very, very productive, to make us think along these lines.
Thank you for your provocative questions. It's really nice to meet you in this space, Stelios. The first question, if we flatly compare these two traditions, it is very difficult to discuss further into a philosophical arguments or discussions, I think. So the freedom, the concept of freedom or the concept of autonomy is very, these terms cannot be found within Confucian context. It's very distinctively Christian culture. It reflects a Christian culture, I think. When we talk about freedom, human freedom, it's always freedom of individual freedom, and the and in Christian culture, the human soul, the individual soul, must be saved. In Christian culture, so the individuality becomes very important. But in Confucian context, the family is the core of the culture. So individual freedom is not that important. It's not as important as the freedom of one family, of a family.
Yeah,
so
and no will. Individual will. I mean, is there individual will in the Confucian?
Individual will. I will talk about that. I'm not free. I'm not free to choose anything without recourse to the interest of my family members. But individuality arises when one resists, when one makes resistance, or when one stands against the authority. He risks his own life for the just cause. In that case, he is the master of his own self. So there you can find a kind of individual will, very strong individual will in that case. So even though they didn't develop the concept of individual freedom or individual will, I think in the culture, underlying the culture is the concept of individual will there. So it's very this question is very important, and I've think about this for a long time, and I found very interesting phenomena in Confucian culture concerning individualism. Individuals always come up in a negative sense, in a negative way. Individuals do not claim themselves positively, but if something goes wrong, if the kings violate the moral norms, a person think valuable, then he stood up against the king as an individual, risking the lives of his own family members. So, so it's very interesting to observe that kind of phenomenon. And the second question, the virtue ethics. There are moments of virtue ethics in Confucian philosophy, but also there is a moment of deontological ethics there, principle-oriented. That the rules of heaven are like Kantian principles, moral principles. It's a kind of categorical imperative prescribing the actions of individuals. So it's not simple matter whether Confucian ethics is simply a virtue ethics of Aristotelian sort, or whether it's a Kantian deontological ethics. You can find both elements.
Thank you so much. Just
Right.
also the aesthetics part is also, you can find the aesthetics analogy in Aristotle, the aesthetics connection. What's here?
I see. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have many hands that are raised. So first, let's start with Professor Kleingeld, followed by Professor Roitoro, and then Professor Jalla.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Sure,
Yes,
yeah, I
yes, we
can
can.
hear you.
I just want to thank you, first of all, for a wonderful lecture. Thank you very much. And I have a comment more than a question. And the comment is, when you were talking about the heaven, the notion of heaven in Confucianism and the limits of language, I was thinking about Kant's discussion of the limits of language and the importance of analogy and symbolic language when we talk about ideas of reason, because they cannot be directly exhibited. When we discuss God, we talk about God in human language. And I just thought that might be kind of interesting to pursue the commonality of that awareness of the limits of language. But thank you very much for your talk.
Yeah, I also think that that's a very interesting, that would be an interesting topic to pursue. Thank you for the comment.
Then Professor Roitoro.
Thank you for your conference. Well, as far as I understood, Confucianism is dominant in South Korea and in that part of Asia. But my question is, in what circumstances started the interest of researcher philosopher in Kantian philosophy, and if there is South Korean society, I was coming a little later due to technical problems. I'm not clear if there is in fact a South Korean society or a group, a research group, and if there, from which time. And another question is, you stated that critical philosophy rendered metaphysics important, but the critical philosophy is concentrated in the critique of pure reason. But in the critique of pure reason, Kant states, formulate his sketch his plan for his new metaphysics against the old metaphysics, the alte metaphysics. And as a fact, in the critique of pure reason, we are confronted with general metaphysics. And in this in the same critical period, that is after the first edition of the critique, in the Metaphysischen Volksgründe, metaphysics of natural science, we are confronted with the metaphysica specialis. Then with two types of metaphysics, generalis and specialis. There are other types of metaphysica specialis, but what can you explain this importance of metaphysics against this production of metaphysics, these formulations of general and special metaphysics in Kant? And that is your assertion with what Kant has done in fact with this his metaphysics generalis and specialis.
Frankly speaking, I think that Kant almost destroyed metaphysics. He calls his work as a kind of propedeutic to metaphysics. Not yet transcendental philosophy is not yet is falling short of real metaphysics. But I'm not sure whether after Kant, whether we have metaphysics in its real sense. But I totally agree to the idea, Kant's idea that even though metaphysics in its traditional sense or in its full-fledged sense or in general sense is not possible, we are not free from the metaphysical desire of asking the conditions and the limits of our human existence and the beyond our lives sort. So in that sense, I think the Kant's idea of metaphysics is still the question we may have in this contemporary world. Thank you for your your distinction between special metaphysics and general metaphysics in Kant. And for the first question, I'm not sure whether I understood your question correctly about, yeah, South Korea is very influenced by the Confucian ideology. They actually took Confucianism as an official ideology to run country. It's almost for over 500 years. Moral politics have been there in Korea, and still I think we are underlying the society, the atmosphere, the culture is still prevailing. Korean Confucian culture is still prevailing. So that's why I am trying to understand what's going on in our culture and how the cultures are so different. Now, while I was studying in the States, I always had that question: why are we so different? What is this? So the individualism question and also autonomy question, these questions, and also the question of democracy and also the question of righteousness, the righteousness and pursuing interest. In Confucianism, they are distinctive values, but in capitalist societies, we are directed toward the value of pursuing interest and also the it's really yes, the culture is I think is very culture matters most, I think, in our contemporary lives.
Thank you.
Thank you
We'll
for
take a
your
question from
comment and
Professor Sala.
question.
Thank you so much, Professor Kim, for the contrastive comparison between Confucius and Kant. You framed this analysis in terms of a geographical contrast between East and West types of tradition, types of philosophy. I think that there is an equally important contrast to note here, as far as Confucius and Kant are concerned, between ancient and modern. On my view, the primary factor is the ancient origin projected onto European history, the pre-Kantian status of Confucius on one side, and the highly modern status of Kant on the other side. So that even if we had a comparison within Western philosophy between a pre-Socratic philosopher on one side and Kant on the other side, we would have similar issues about pre-individual, the rule of ethics that is not yet morality, all those things that apply to the contrast between Confucius and Kant. So could we abstract perhaps for theoretical purposes from the East-West part and focus on the ancient modern part, and then ask ourselves, how can moderns like us, even in South Korea, still be ancients? How far is that possible? And how far is it no longer possible, even in South Korea, even with regard to Confucianism? Thank you very much.
Thank you. The distinction between ancient and modern, I'm not sure. Throughout the Western history, you have a kind of distinct changes in political regimes and in the system of polity. But in East Asia, until the early 20th century, the political system was a kind of an ancient form, king and subject and people. So but the culture itself has been changed. So you cannot say just East Asia. They do not have modernity problem. It's really difficult to how to define the East Asian societies or the history. If we use the same criteria, then you cannot see the East Asian societies correctly or in a right way. So it's how to define in terms of in what terms do we have to distinguish different parts of history. I'm not quite sure about that. The modernity question, Descartes' philosophy is a kind of marks the beginning of modern philosophy, and also the Industrial Revolution marks a certain beginning of a modernity question. But in East Asia, they had kept for 1,000 years almost the same political system, and it ended at only in 20th century. So it's really difficult to.
Would you like a brief follow-up question, Professor Zeller?
Well, but with the 20th century, that modernity has arrived. More recently, perhaps, than in the West. So that's why I wanted to articulate the ancient and modernity issue over the East and West issue. because I think that is something that the East and West even share in the current situation. It's a modern South Korea, a modern Japan, and even in a sense, a modern China. But thank you very much. Thank you also for the answer.
Thank you. Professor Chu?
Well, thank you. First, I hope that there will be text for reading because the subject covered is so interesting and broad. And I have two questions. The first is on heaven, which Professor Kleingeld already touched. I think two questions both you raised, but I could not hear your answer. So is heaven a volitional power or Kantian idea? So would you say that what is your answer to that? And the second question is the paradox you raised, that beyond the reason of the language, what is it? What is that beyond reason of language? In particular, I want to ask you, in the third critique, there's this called reflective power. It's a judgment, which is outside the reason, and perhaps it's outside of a language in the first critique. Would that be an answer?
No, I don't think I will answer to your second question first. The reflective judgment in the third critique is not a kind of transcendental reflection. Reflective judgment is the judgment that that does not define, determine the object. It is not something. It is not the judgment that determine an object with certain predicates. But between through the experience, through the harmony of understanding and sensibility, there arises a kind of feeling. I can't thought that way. So reflective judgment is just to reflect upon an object you are confronting. It's not determining relationship, but reflecting relationship, subjective reflection. So, the going beyond the limit of language and reason is what actually philosophy is trying to reach by asking the question about the whole, by asking the question of the foundation of a whole knowledge, the foundation of our life, foundation of our existence. In that question, we try to go beyond the context where we are living. But while you are asking that kind of philosophical question, you are still within that context, using the reason you are criticizing or you want to go beyond. So there is a kind of circularity there always. That's a kind of circularity that you cannot avoid. And also there is a kind of paradoxical situation arise there when you ask about yourself. So there is a paradox of self-referentiality.
May I?
Thank you.
So that's the
reply. Now, Kant has this doctrine of method, which he separates the concept construction from the intuition of the construct of the concept. There seems to be very much separate what is a constructed concept and what we make out of the concept. That's intuition. It seems completely within Kant's domain.
Well, as far as I understand Kant, and intuition in Kant is always sensible. It's not intellectual. We are not allowed intellectual intuition. So and also the construction takes place in sensible intuition. Mathematical concepts are a construction, intuitive construction. So I'm not sure whether I get it, your question or not. The first question, heaven. Yes, I think in Confucianism, heaven has a kind of volitional power, but it's very unclear whether it is an agent or not. It cannot. Heaven is a kind of ambiguous meaning. In one way, the grand nature, but also it is a kind of personified nature, like Christian God involved in individual lives. So heaven has a kind of a volitional power, but there is no subjectivity there. We do not know what kind of subjectivity involved in that kind of exerting volitional power.
Then we shall move on to Professor Er.
Yeah, thank you very much for your fascinating talk. When you were developing the contrast between mainly Confucius and Kant, you were relying on a picture of Kant's philosophy, which very much stressed the negative attitude towards transcendent metaphysics in Kant, and also read his project in moral philosophy in a strongly justificatory manner. And that it's interesting for me, especially for somebody working in Japan, that this picture of Kant is very widespread here too, and in a sense probably also due to the influence of my predecessors working here, like neo-Kantians and philosophers from other dominions from Germany. But I was wondering if you look, or if you take a different approach to Kant and see, for example, his attempt to provide something like a practical grounding of transcendent metaphysics on the one hand, and also when reading his project in moral philosophy in a more reconstructive manner, starting from the assumption of the validity of categorical obligation and then trying to somehow find an account which fits morality into the overall picture of our worldview as a whole, then I wonder, to what extent can you uphold the strong contrast you claim there is between the Confucian tradition and the Kantian tradition? Is it then really this moment of, let's say, reflectivity, of trying to understand and still have some kind of distance towards what is immediately given to us as a moral obligation, or what exactly is the contrast you see? Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. It's a very good question, I think. I really appreciate your question. I think it's just for the purpose of discussion, I kind of radicalized that kind of contrast between a Confucian attitude towards using a lot of examples instead of going to theoretical justification of morality or of knowledge. But I think there are with the with regard to the point you made, I think there is more similarities than contrast or than disparity between Kant and Confucian philosophy, I think. And the Confucianism is strongly morality-centered philosophy and emphasized the sincerity and devotions towards something. It's a kind of moral, stressed moral purity of mind. So kind of self-discipline and also the make yourself pure and free of desires and so on. Like Kantian approach to the categorical imperatives, the obligating human mind to be free of desires. So I think there are that kind of elements that can be compared with respect to the commonalities. But for the purpose of the discussions and making points, I radicalized the contrasts. And also I was very interested in the aspect of overcoming the paradox raised in the discourse of philosophy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Professor Juan Jose.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Kim, for this amazing and very interesting talk. I would like to make one comment and question regarding once again the role of personal freedom and individuality in Confucianism, because from what you replied to the first question, it seems that there is not like a personal or individual freedom, but rather freedom inside the family. And I wonder, where would you locate Confucianism regarding this thesis of the axial epoch formulated by Karl Jaspers and to my knowledge previously by Schelling himself in the Methods on Academic Studies, where he states that the idea of individuality is not really exclusively Western idea, but rather that comes in this actual period in all monotheistic religions and also in the conceptions of Asia. If I remember correctly, he mentions there Buddhism and other Eastern traditions. And I wonder if, as a second very brief comment, we could use, or you could think, the role of the individual in the family as a way of, let's say, delimiting a private sphere of the family against a more collectivist approach of the state. Because from what I remember from other studies I made in Argentina, for instance, in China, Confucianism was labeled as a kind of liberal bourgeois philosophy, precisely because of this kind of retreat into the private sphere through the family. So I wonder if there would be an element of personal freedom or of individuality that we could access through this kind of intricate path. Thank you so much.
I know a little about Jasper's axial age, but concerning the question of individual freedom, I think from the Western perspective, individual freedom, you cannot find that level of individual freedom within Confucian society, I think. But as an individual who is living in this context, I think that within the culture where there is no concept of a kind of confrontation between an individual and a holy God, what would the concept of individual freedom in this kind of culture? If there is no confrontation, there is no absolute I from which you see yourself. There is nothing in Confucian society, but there is a absolute value ordained by heaven, like the rule of humanity or value of benevolence sort. It's a kind of an ideal one individual must pursue. And that ideal always brings others together, especially family members, especially people who are close to you. So if those people are not free, then I'm not free. My freedom is always a kind of function of those other parameters. So it's not an individual, independent parameter which can be considered without recourse to those other elements. So, so in that sense, I'm not sure whether we have to talk about individual freedom from only from the Western perspective. What kind of freedom we are thinking in this kind of culture, in this Confucian culture? That's the question I always have.
Thank you so much.
All right. Looks like we don't have any hands up, so we will officially end our Q&A, and perhaps some of you might pursue a further question informally with Professor Kim, if you want. So please join me in thanking Professor Kim for the wonderful lecture.
Thank you. Thank you.